Today's video is going to be about Seamus Heaney's translation of Beowulf. As part of my 2024 TBR, I really want to get through some old epics. Some of the great poems. One of them, for example, that I'm going through is the Odyssey by Homer. I've previously read the Iliad. Not the best piece of literature I've ever read. That's maybe a topic for another video unto itself. And to be honest, I'm finding a very similar thing with the Odyssey. The prose, and this might be a translation issue, but it's probably also a problem with the original text, is that it's so repetitive and boring, focused on what are, to the modern reader's ears, completely irrelevant details. I don't need to know how to build a boat in the year 200 BC. It's irrelevant. I don't want to read 2 pages worth of that kind of content. I also don't need to know the exact lineage of all the different people that I'm meeting who happen to give an oar to Odysseus. That's my gripe with these types of epics. Seamus Heaney's translation of Beowulf is a different thing unto itself. I might be a little bit biased given I myself hail from about 20 minutes away from where Seamus Heaney grew up, but his word choice, he acknowledges this in his note about this translation at the start of this copy. He deliberately chose some old Ulster or Irish word. One example, just to name one among many, is thole. It sounds like such an old word and it just sounds so succinct, thole, and it means to suffer. And strangely enough, it's an Ulster or Irish slang word, often used by a little bit of the older generation to mean to suffer. They'll thole themselves, they'll suffer amongst themselves. But in the original Old English that Beowulf was originally written in the year 800 to 900, it means to suffer. Tholian, suffering. So I think it might be a translation thing, but Seamus Heaney's rendition of this poetry far exceeds anything I've written from the Greeks or the translations of the Greeks. It might also be an issue with translating from such a different, distinct and distant language like ancient Greek compared to translating from something which is just Old English, where, at least as someone who can speak German as well, a lot of it kind of, not a lot, but maybe about 20%, I could probably just read. Like, hörde ich, I heard, heil, to hail, all these sorts of things. Ich höne, just kind of comes across to my ear as close. So that might have made it a little bit easier for the translator. Now, one thing I didn't know until I read the introduction to this copy of Beowulf is that Old English poetry didn't necessarily rhyme. Rhyming wasn't the main thing that they went for like English poetry. What they went for instead was alliteration in certain parts, aligning to stress within the stanza and within the line. So what's absolutely breathtaking by Seamus Heaney in this is his ability to turn the English, modern English, to that literary technique. And just to give you an example of how amazing the translation is generally as an element of prose and elevating simple language to prose and verse, I thought I'd read you a little example. This is Beowulf's fight with Grendel. This is at line 749 until about 765. I'll see where I stop in the copy that I have. The captain of evil discovered himself in a hand gripped harder than anything he had ever encountered in any man on the face of the earth. Every bone in his body quailed and recoiled, but he could not escape. He was desperate to flee to his den and hide with the devil's litter, for in all his days he had never been clamped or cornered like this. Then Hygelaic's trusty retainer recalled his bedtime speech, sprang to his feet, and got a firm hold. Fingers were bursting, the monster backtracking, the man overpowering. So that gives you a little example of the amazing work that Seamus Heaney was able to do with this Old English poem, Beowulf. A little bit of a synopsis. Beowulf is a lord, a chief, a thane, I'm not entirely sure what he is exactly, in Scandinavia. He hears of some trouble that the Danes are having south across the sea, so he goes with his merry men and finds that they're being absolutely demolished by Grendel. who, and this is something that I'll talk about a little bit later, is what I understood to be the main theme of Beowulf, at least from a modern reader's perspective. He finds out that Grendel is a descendant of Cain. That is the biblical Cain, the murderer of Abel. Now that aside, and I'll deal with it more in a later part of the video, he finds that Grendel is ransacking the great hall of the king of the Danes, and he boasts that he is the strongest amongst his men back in his home of Geatland, and so he undertakes to destroy Grendel. He waits with his men in the great hall and waits for night to fall. Grendel comes, he attacks like always, kills one of Beowulf's men. But Beowulf succeeds. He fights back in a way that no one's ever been able to before and takes off one of Grendel's arms from the shoulder down. And here's the moment in Seamus Heaney's rendition of Grendel getting his arm absolutely torn off his shoulder. Then he who had harrowed the hearts of men with pain and affliction in former times, and had given offence also to God, found that his bodily powers failed him. Hygelaic's kinsmen kept him helplessly, locked in a hand grip. As long as either lived, he was hateful to the other. The monster's whole body was in pain. A tremendous wound appeared on his shoulder. Sinews split and the bone lappings burst. Beowulf was granted the glory of winning. Grendel was driven under the fen banks, fatally hurt to his desolate lair. And so as you heard, Grendel escapes, goes back to his lair, and he hides with his mother, who herself is a beast and another descendant of Cain. But Beowulf and his men, along with some of Hrothgar's men, chase him down and find that he is hiding beneath a mere, a sort of big lake. Beowulf dives in, spends what seems to me from my reading to be about half a day underwater fighting them, and is eventually successful. He finds a sword that's a magic sword from the old times and lops off their heads. Fantastic. He comes back up and is rewarded. He then returns to his homeland of Geatland and helps his lord and king Hygelac to defeat some invaders. After some years, Hygelac is defeated in battle, and so Beowulf takes over as king. He rules for 50 years in relative peace and success, and he's loved by all, and he's known around and strong, and that is why Geatland itself knows that it's protected. However, there was then a dragon. And I'll talk again about this a little bit later, but the interplay between the old ways and the new ways, the old ways being the pagan religions and Gnosticism, along with the sort of new Christianity that the poet writing this hundreds of years later obviously had in mind. It seems jumbled and muddied, and it's quite an interesting sort of patchwork of ideology. That aside, which I'll deal with a little bit later, to continue on with the synopsis, Beowulf has his land troubled by a dragon who is hiding a hoard of treasure from an ancient race. Beowulf, as usual for a hero of the times, takes it upon himself to slay the dragon. In a great ending scene, Beowulf is successful in killing the dragon, but at the cost of his own life. Just reading from some of the notes that I made while I was reading, one thing that really stood out to me is how direct the prose is. I noticed that there were a lot of Old Ulster words which I talked about a bit earlier, like thole, which means to suffer. And interestingly, the Old English word tholian means to suffer. So I quite liked how direct the prose was. It's something that other books like the Odyssey and the Iliad, at least the translations I've read of those works, really lacks. Something that I really got throughout the entire reading, which by the way took about two to 3 hours, it's really relatively short, and that includes me reading it aloud and repeating parts that I really loved. I thought it captured what I picture a bard from the year 800, 900 would sound like. It sort of playing to the lowest common denominator so that everyone can understand the poem, but at the same time having little bits of wit in there that really just elevate things to make it true art. And for an example of a little bit of wit, there's a section where Beowulf first comes to the Danes' Great Hall and is faced with Unferth, a gentleman who thinks that the tale of Beowulf defeating some sea monster was actually just him telling porkies. And so this is Beowulf's retort. Beowulf, Ecgtheow's son, replied, "Well, friend Unferth, you have had your say about Brecca and me, but it was mostly beer that was doing the talking. The truth is this." And then he goes on to tell the story as he sees it of him defeating a great sea serpent. He goes on about this, and it's really great reading. And then at the end, and this is about line 582 in this copy, "Now I cannot recall any fight you entered, Unferth, that bears comparison. I don't boast when I say that neither you nor Brecca were ever much celebrated for swordsmanship or for facing danger on the field of battle. You killed your own kith and kin, so for all your cleverness and quick tongue, you will suffer damnation in the depths of hell." So some of the little bits of wit like that really just created this image in my mind of a bard walking in some medieval town in northern England, telling some Viking Saxons this tale of the great Beowulf. Now, one of the major themes, aside from the obvious like heroism, courage, loyalty, fealty, the trappings of power and other things like that, those aside, an underlying current that is just persistent and prevailing throughout this entire text is what I mentioned earlier, the interplay between the old ways and the new ways. Now, I haven't done much research on this, but the poem really smacked of a new rendition of an old story. It really sounded like there might have been a Beowulf poem that was recited as a song by bards around the world, at least the northwestern European world, that would have dealt with all the same story points and all the same sort of traditional themes that I mentioned earlier: heroism, power, the trappings of power, fealty, loyalty, and all the rest of it. It seems to me like that might have been an original poem in an oral tradition, and then a monk, or whoever the unknown author is of Beowulf as we now know it, added in and just smashed in, jutted in little bits of Christianity. There are examples throughout this. One thing I noticed in particular was that at the end of Seamus Heaney's chosen paragraph breaks, there's a lot of reference to God Almighty deciding who is right and who is wrong. And it seems to me like it's just sort of been tacked on to the end, rather than baked into the weaving of what is actually happening in the story. So it seems to me like there's just been an extra 4 lines added every here and there, and they sound similar, to say effectively that whoever just won the battle that you just read or listened to won because of Almighty God. And this, for example, there's a section at about line 570 where there's the hero Beowulf, and I'll try not to spoil it too much, exerted his power over nature, is how I view it, and he bended nature to his will. And it's sort of represented as doing that is something to aspire to, which is something that, as I understand it, is a pagan sort of belief. And then smashed into that is God giving light randomly to the scene. God in the Christian sense of the word God. And to me that just smacks of a new invention. Doesn't seem congruent with the rest of what's going on. Another section where this happens is around line 1530. It's basically a section where the hero is relying on strength, exertion of will, etc. To best Grendel's mother. And then the poet in the last lines of that section gives credit to God for that success. Not credit to the smith that made the old sword from the ancient times, that would obviously be pagan. Not to the very pagan hero, the very heathen hero that is Beowulf. Not to any of those things, and not to the ability of man to exert will over nature, but instead to God. That sort of took things away from parts of the poem for me, and it sort of diluted elements of it. But that said, it was an absolutely fantastic read. One thing that I took away from it, and I don't believe this would have been deliberate, but there was a sort of sense of symbolism being put in there to represent the old ways being destroyed or thrown away by the new ways, and the new ways being the way to overcome old evils. And one thing that really struck me in this is the entire last section with the dragon and the horde, where the new ways of self-sacrifice, very Christian belief, in the service of others and to be meek and take destruction. Although it's very close to the pagan idea of dying in victorious battle, there's a sort of sense that the author is trying to say that if you want to do away with the old ways, with the old evils, with the old troubles of war, take on the new way of Christianity and all will be right. Now, I'm not sure that's entirely correct, but given the world we live in. But it's certainly a point that I think was put forward by the author. And yeah, just a closing note, I guess, is that on that dragon, on the ending with the dragon and the horde, it's effectively, I read it at least, as a sort of message from the author to the listener, or reader, to not dig up the old ways. If you dig up the old ways, a dragon will kill you.